So the presentation today will be made by three members of the team of the Brooklyn Public Library, and they are really at the forefront of this effort to counter book banning. Nick Higgins is the chief librarian of the Brooklyn Public Library. In concert with other team members of his senior management team, Nick leads the development of transformational library services and spaces for the 2.8 million residents in Brooklyn, New York. Nick began his career in 2006 at the Brooklyn Public Library as librarian trainee, and then moved on to the different departments within the library, ultimately being in the Central Library in Brooklyn. He also, interestingly, has served for 3 years at the New York Public Library Correctional Library Supervisor as the supervisor, creating library services at the Rikers Island Jail Complex and in state and federal prisons. In 2017, Nick was named Mover and Shaker by Library Journal for building a citywide library-based video visiting services for kids with incarcerated parents. Nick and his team were recognized as Librarian of the Year by the Library Journal for their work on Books Unbanned, a freedom to read initiative that provides free access to Brooklyn Public Library's entire digital library collection for teens anywhere in the US facing book bans. And Nick is joined by Summer Boismier. I know I didn't get that right, Summer, but you'll have to correct me when you chime in. She is the Teen Initiatives Project Manager at the Brooklyn Public Library, where she supports young adult initiatives such as Books Unbanned and the Intellectual Freedom Team Meetup. She's an Oklahoma expatriate and former English teacher, where she was District Teacher of the Year for Piedmont Public Schools in Oklahoma 2018 and 19. She was also recognized by the Oklahoma State Department of Education as a Rising Star Award recipient in 2019. Summer is originally from Oklahoma and was at the forefront of the book banning, in combating book banning when she was down in Oklahoma. And she ultimately resigned her position down there based on the actions being taken to ban books. And then later in this presentation, we have Christopher Lau, who is a high school student. So he can't join us right now because he's still in school. He's a passionate advocate for diverse literature in the face of book bans, particularly those targeting marginalized communities. Witnessing the alarming surge in book bans sweeping across the country, he utilizes his editing and social media skills to raise awareness and to spark conversations. He even has his own YouTube channel to get at this called Urban Coolies, which he can tell us about later. So he will chime in when he gets home. I'm sure he's rushing home because he doesn't want to miss a lot of this presentation. So now that you have a sense of who's presenting today, I'd like to pass this over to Nick, and then he will engage Summer, and then Nick will join. Christopher will join them later. Nick.
Great. Thank you, Louise. And thank you everyone at Encore Learning for inviting us. This is it's an honor for us to be here to talk about this important issue with other like-minded individuals, people who support libraries, who are interested in intellectual freedom. It's really an honor to be here. So thank you everyone at Encore Learning. And again, I'm Nick Higgins. I'm the chief librarian of Brooklyn Public Library. And we're here to talk about intellectual freedom and standing up against book bans that have been proliferating across the United States, as you likely know, over the past several years. But more broadly, sort of what impact this has on democratic institutions and some of the overlapping strategies to attack those democratic institutions and where libraries fit into that picture. So as Louise mentioned, we have a young person who's going to come and join us, who's rushing home from school right now. And what we really want to do at Brooklyn Public Library and elsewhere is to center teen voices, young people who are oftentimes at the business end of some of these censorship efforts across the country and who are looking for more responsible adults to give them support and to help them push back on some of these attacks. So Christopher will join us when he's out of school, and what we'll do if we're in the middle of our presentation, what we'll try to do is fast forward to Christopher spot in the presentation. He has a short video to share, and he has a lot to say. And then because he's a teenager and he's very busy, he's off to volleyball practice. So we want to make sure that he has enough time to have space to talk about what's important to him, and then send him on his way to his busy teenage life, and support him that way. So again, we have a few slides to share, my colleague Summer and I, and a formal presentation, and then we are very curious to hear what you have to say, and we'll open up to questions and answers and have a dialogue with everyone who's on the call. So I will share my screen. I'm going to go here and find it right. Haha, here we are. So again, my name is Nick Higgins. I'm the Chief Librarian of Brooklyn Public Library. We began Books Unbanned, a freedom to read initiative that pushes back against censorship 2 years ago. At Brooklyn Public Library, we, along with others across the country, were alarmed at the proliferation of book bans and challenges that were happening in record numbers in libraries and schools across the country. And we, as a much larger institution, we were kicking around some ideas about how we could help young people where they were to provide some sort of helpful interventions and support them as they were facing a crisis in their communities. What we decided to do, as Louise mentioned, was to essentially open up our entire ebook and audiobook collection of over 500,000 items to any young person in the country, age 13 to 21, who basically requested help from the Brooklyn Public Library. All they would have to do to get access to our collections was to write us a note, and they could tell us about any sort of censorship that they were facing in their communities, any book bans or challenges. They could talk about access issues that they were having. Perhaps they were living pretty far from the nearest library and they just didn't have a whole lot of access to books, or anything that they wanted to tell us. Their support of libraries, different challenges they were facing in their community. And once we received that letter, we would send them what we call an e-card, a digital library card, to the Brooklyn Public Library, and they would activate that card and they would have immediate access for free any book in our in our library system of digital books and audiobooks. So this is giving them access to banned books and books that they just want to read. So really important to mention here is that this is an initiative that on the surface is there to nullify censorship efforts at the local level and give teens an intervention that they can that's helpful to them. But underneath all of that is really what we're trying to do is model essentially what a good public library should be doing, giving access, unfettered access to an entire collection of books and material that people want to read, banned books or books that they just want to, or romance novels or anything they want to read. We fully support that and want to model that for other people. So I'll pass this over to you, Summer.
Thank you so much, Nick. Hi, everybody. My name is Summer Boismier. It's good to see you in the virtual space today. My pronouns are she, her. I want to echo what Nick has already said about the sort of essential and evolving role of libraries in our communities, why libraries are currently targets for censorious extremists, and why the ways in which we respond to such censorship matter, right? Not only for the future of libraries themselves and the multicultural, pluralistic democracy we pursue, but really for the lives between, behind, and before the pages on our shelves. Before I came to Brooklyn Public Library, as Louise also mentioned, I was a veteran high school English teacher in Oklahoma. So what you see on the screen right now is a message that I received from a student shortly after the fallout from my decision to share a library QR code to Books Unbanned with my students on the first day of school, way back, it feels like a million years ago, but in August 2022. So as you may or may not know, that decision also made my first day my last. I think these words, much like the individual behind them, speak for themselves. And that really is what we are here, again, like Nick said, to discuss today. So no one should ever feel helpless, quoting the student here, no one should ever feel like intellectual freedom advocacy is silly. No one should ever feel as though nobody cares. But that's where we are, or at least that's where the students sitting in classrooms right now are, and they're telling us how they feel. So it really is time we listen. And I think, Nick, we're ready for the next slide. Awesome. So what you see on the screen here are a couple pictures of the same space. So this was my classroom at Norman High School in Norman, Oklahoma. I'm an English teacher, so I had a pretty large classroom library. Shortly after, we received a directive from our upper admin at my school to restrict or remove student access to books that could possibly violate an educational gag order Oklahoma has as law. My classroom suddenly looked like the photo that you see there on the bottom of the screen. I'm a certified educator with around about 10 years of public school experience back in Oklahoma. So in 2021, Oklahoma passed an educational gag order known as HB 1775. Per PEN America, in the 2023 state legislative session, 10 educational gag orders became law. Another 4 were enacted through executive order or other regulation. And what that means is, as of last November, there have been 40 educational gag orders on the books in 22 states. So 22 states who have classrooms that could possibly look like this. Yeah, at their core, these laws really do attempt to restrict conversations around race, sex, and gender in educational spaces. In other words, they are really just fill in the blank bigotry. In large part because of Oklahoma's law, teachers across the state, including myself, were told, as I already said, to restrict or remove student access to titles we felt might violate our state's ed gag order. And I believe Encore Learning is based in Virginia. And I also believe Virginia has something similar with Governor Youngkin's Executive Order 1. As we'll echo throughout the presentation, and as Nick will tell you here on the next slide, this ain't about the books, folks. We've been talking about book bans, censorship, and the importance of intellectual freedom for years now. However, that we often excludes the very voices that matter most, those of young people, especially those of the young people from historically marginalized communities, who are the primary targets of so much of the state-sponsored censorship. So make no mistake, looking at these pictures here, when my students, some of whom are members of those marginalized communities, walked into our classroom on that first day of school, they got the message loud and clear. So much like their stories, the state of Oklahoma and a few others as well wants them erased. I think we're ready for the next slide, Nick.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Summer. So as Summer was mentioning, we at Brooklyn Public Library also understood that it's really not just about the books, the action of taking a title off of the shelf and hiding it from view, because the vast majority of the books that are being challenged and banned they're overwhelmingly by or about people of color, by or about LGBTQ plus communities. It's a very targeted. It's something different than that we're seeing here than other sort of eras of book banning. This is certainly targeting particular communities, and we wanted to make sure that those voices are being protected, they're being raised, and they're being heard. So with that in mind, underneath all of our intervention at Books Unbanned, we wanted to make sure that we had 3 or 4 goals that we were reaching. One was to reach teens where they are. That's really this intervention with the digital library card, making sure that there's a direct intervention in their lives when they're facing so many challenges in their communities. This is sort of our emergency room approach to our program. much like somebody who needs to go to the emergency room is thankful that they have that available to them. We wanted to make sure that young people who are in crisis have some access to the books that they want to read. Another goal was to center teen voices. There's nothing, we don't make anything for teens without teens. So we wanted to make sure that we were centering teen voices in everything that we did and that we do, up to and including asking them at the very front of our Books Unbanned initiative if this was even a good idea for a public library to be entering into this space. And they helped us. A lot of our teen interns, they gave their feedback. Some of them weren't aware that their peers in other parts of the country were actually going through some of these challenges and bans. So they saw it as an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the topic, to learn about how to support their peers in other parts of the country, and also learn how to make sure that it doesn't happen here in this city where they have their libraries and their schools. So centering teen voices and making sure that they're in the middle of it. Our third goal was just supporting teens and taking control of their narratives. The conversation around book bans and challenges, particularly a couple of years ago when we started Books Unbanned, was really being driven by the loudest voices in the rooms, the ones, individuals who would go into a school board meeting and shout down principals and educators and turn what's usually a very staid kind of meeting upside down. People who would go into a library and shout across the reference desk at a librarian, demanding that a book be pulled from the shelf. That would make a lot of noise. It would draw a lot of attention. We thought that there was a much more positive, affirming story about democratic institutions that needed to be told and was being told but wasn't being heard. So we wanted to situate a positive story about intellectual freedom in the places where they belong, from libraries, from public schools, and from advocates, many of whom I'd imagine are on this call today. And then, underneath all of this is not just talking about it, not just thinking about it, not just getting into a room and sort of sharing ideas, but to take action and to keep taking it, making sure that we're present for young people, particularly in communities that need them the most. And again, pulling back a little bit, it's not just about the books. It's not just about banning individual titles in a particular library. This is about what American Library Association President Emily Drabinski says. This is not just simply about books. This is about wanting the entire library to disappear. This is about an institution that's been fairly sturdy over the past 150 plus odd years in this country, that has endured many challenges and many crises, but has endured because it is an institution that is embedded in the democratic process here in the country, and also basically it encapsulates a lot of what we strive for in our democracy. So we have a lot to stand on. We have a lot to be proud of. The library endures because the library is personal. Everyone in this room, I would imagine, has a library origin story. We fell in love with libraries at a very early age, oftentimes, and that has carried us through. And the library is with us sort of throughout our lives. It's an institution that we can have a longitudinal relationship with, no matter what age. The library is in the center of the community, oftentimes, and it's a space available for everyone. There's personal stories that are developed out of a library. The library is hopeful. It's not just an optimistic kind of, things are going to get better one day. It's hopeful because it's a site where people come together and they work together for a better future. It's a site where that kind of thing can happen. It can only happen because the library is also democratic. Everyone is invited. There are no barriers to access. Everyone is included in this process, so we can work together to build the communities that we want. And the library is the consciousness of our communities. It's no surprise that books are the target these days, because books that are on the shelves in our libraries, they reflect who we are, who we aspire to be. They reflect the lives and the hopes and dreams of people that we might not be in contact with in our communities, but who belong in our communities and deserve to be celebrated. These public institutions reflect the consciousness of our communities. And as you'll see here, this is one of our teen interns, Audrey. The library is personal. This is sort of what we're talking about here. There is joy in Audrey's face, who we just happened upon at an event at a Crown Heights library. Audrey was wearing the Books Unbanned t-shirt, so we took a picture of Audrey. But Audrey also has a library origin story, just like we all do. Audrey is an intern in a couple of our programs here at the library. Audrey and many other people who use the libraries love the library because it's again something that's very near and dear to their relationship with their communities. Again, I can ask a lot of elected officials when we're advocating for a better budget in our city, what they love about the library. And some will tell me that they haven't been to a library in many years, but they have a very good story about going to a library and a very good experience. So we receive a lot of support from people who love the library and also have a really great shot at getting advocacy from people who don't necessarily use libraries. The library is a non-coercive space, particularly for young people. This is very important. Schools are very important, but they're also very directed. Libraries are one of the rare spaces that young people can go into, and they're only guided necessarily by their own curiosity and what interests them. And the library is also a place where young people can start to develop and sort of understand their internal lives. And I know this sort of makes parents a little bit nervous. I'm a parent of a couple of teenagers, and I understand that there's, things going on inside their heads that might worry me, but it doesn't mean that young people don't deserve or have a right to their own internal private lives. And this is a library, again, a non-coercive space where young people can develop that sense of self and private and internal life.
Okay, that one is me. So again, like Nick said, the library is personal. I worked in my past life in a college town in central Oklahoma called Norman. And Norman is approximately 1,500 miles from Central Library in Brooklyn. So what had started for me when I covered my shelves in my classroom library, in the image you saw a few slides ago, what had started as an individual stand against really state-sanctioned censorship within the four walls of an English classroom spread almost overnight into the school's hallways, the college town's suburban lawns, onto sidewalks downtown, and eventually into the inboxes of journalists across the country, and even a Twitter thread from a former president. Folks across the state of Oklahoma, including young people who had possibly never browsed their own community library's collection, dove deep into BPLs through Books Unbanned. And of course, our story, I should say, spread to Brooklyn as well. In turn, there are, and I find this infinitely humorous on my end, there are now a sizable number of BPL staff who know Norman, Oklahoma, as if they were lifelong locals. And this was personal, this is personal. And Oklahomans wouldn't tolerate censorship in their schools. So as an educator, I always ask instinctively, the question, what's the lesson here? And again, I think that lesson has something to do not only with young people, but the reach of a library and how personal it can become.
Thank you, Summer. And the library is hopeful. A lot of what undergirds the Books Unbanned program and our stance on intellectual freedom and pushing back against censorship is really baked into the profession itself through a couple of documents. One is the American Library Association Bill of Rights. There's actually 7 different points. I pulled out 3 here that really focus in on making sure that collections are maintained and that require libraries to collect from all points of view on current and historical issues. One that actually requires libraries to challenge censorship, and it's a responsibility to provide information and enlightenment to everyone who walks through our doors. And then cooperating with other institutions, advocates, and libraries to resist the abridgment of free expression wherever we find it. This is the Library Bill of Rights that was written in the late 1930s, adopted in 1939, the background of World War II and the rise of authoritarianism across the ocean, but also here in the United States, as we saw a lot of small groups across the country stand up in different towns to demand that certain books, particularly books by John Steinbeck, interestingly enough, be pulled off shelves of libraries in local communities. And same as 1939, we're seeing it here in 2024. Another document that we looked at when we developed Books Unbanned was the Freedom to Read Statement that was written and adopted in the early 1950s, again during the Red Scare in America. And again, this is another document that has several different points, but I pulled out a couple that are really pointing to it's a little bit more forceful than the American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights. This is actually centering our responsibility as a profession, not only as librarians, but publishers and other advocates to stand up with other organizations to push back against censorship, no matter where we find it. And again, that sort of undergirds everything that we do with our intellectual freedom work.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I think in the awareness of time here, we'll go ahead and skip the video that you see on the screen, but I could tell you a little bit about what this is, or who this is. So as Nick has sort of echoed, in some of his comments, representation matters. Stories and who gets to tell them matter. And so you see on the screen, this is Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, often known as the mother of multicultural children's literature. And she argued that stories are mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. You may have heard that phrase before. So stories can also be telescopes and prisms and ladders, and stories are safety, and stories are power. Whatever object, a window, a prism, a curtain, a dingle hopper, is used to qualify a reader's encounter with a text, the message literary censorship sends is always the same. This story doesn't matter, and the lives, maybe yours, reflected in these pages don't either. So identities are not obscenities, as many of these gag orders and divisive concepts laws would infer. And stories they're not poisons, they're possibilities. From the vantage point of history, I think it would be fair to assert that book bans are often less about protecting people and more about enforcing prejudice. And the actions taken by some cowardly adults who seek to restrict a young reader's access to books speak just as loudly, I think, as the words or the pictures that scare said grown-ups. So empathy is dangerous precisely because it takes a sledgehammer to fear. Right? If we don't other differences and hold them at arm's length, then those driving division by justifying censorship in our public schools and libraries lose the power they've amassed, keeping people apart. So I think we can go on to that next slide. Thank you, Nick. Again, what you see up here on the screen is the Books Unbanned QR code and some information about some of our related initiatives aimed at teens. So the question, what's your story, has always been sort of the driving question for me that's guided my approach to teaching. It's a question I often ask my students. It's a question I ask myself even now. And what I love most, though, about this question is the answer is always changing, right? Stories are lives, and lives are everything. And by expanding access to Brooklyn Public Library's ebook collection and learning databases, librarians are empowering young readers from across the country to explore their myriad identities and those of others more thoughtfully, more freely. But we also recognize the need for coalition and cooperation. And if one person can't access the books they want or need to read, then really none of us can. And we understood that this had to be a group project. So we're hearing time and again from the teens who apply for our e-card that Nick mentioned, or attend our Freedom to Read teen meetups, or participate in our Freedom to Read advocacy institutes. That message is the same, right? They're craving connection and community. two things some of them can no longer find in their local school or public libraries. Next slide, there we go. And I think this one is mine as well. So going back to Norman, Oklahoma, 1,500 miles from where I'm sitting right now, in September 2022, you were just as likely to see the Books Unbanned QR code as you were to see OU football paraphernalia. The university is often referred to as a stadium with an attached campus. So football is a big deal. You'd see yard signs, t-shirts, stickers, buttons, bookmarks. Heck, there's got to be a QR code foam finger out there too by now, and I'll leave it to you to decide which finger. So not only did Books Unbanned bring a new audience to BPL, but it brought BPL, Brooklyn Public Library, to a new audience. And it really opened up a dialogue between Oklahoma and New York that continues to this day. So communities 1,500 miles apart came together in the fight for intellectual freedom because they understood, right, that our public institutions are a reflection of who we are and how we want to live. And as Nick has already mentioned as well, we like to say here at the library, especially in YA services, young adult services, where I work, nothing for teens without teens. So the Intellectual Freedom Teen Meetup is part of the Books Unbanned initiative. It's something that I support as the project manager. And what it is it's a virtual space where teens can come together to discuss intellectual freedom issues, their favorite books, and really all things Books Unbanned. They can connect with peers across the country and learn how to support their peers in protecting the right to read whatever they choose. So what you see up there on the screen are a couple of quotes from some of our teens. And the question they're responding to is, what does intellectual freedom mean to you? And so that first quote, if you can't see it, because I know sometimes the text can be a little small, says, intellectual freedom matters to me because I care a lot about equal rights to information. I believe that everyone deserves the right to learn new information and have access to books. So banning some books, it limits people from learning all they may want to know. And again, these are sentiments expressed by young people and by some of our teens. And here at Brooklyn Public Library, we strive to listen to them in every way possible. Me again. So again, going back to that question, I like to ask myself, what's your story? The library is hopeful and it's personal. So I'd like you to think about 3 questions of your own for just a moment. So the first one is, how would you define the term classics? What titles would you consider classics and why? And then what titles do you think young people care about most? So Nick and I talk a lot about that word classics, and I think he's going to tell you on the next slide in a little bit more detail why. But as an English teacher, when I would hear the word classics, I don't hear 1984. I don't hear Animal Farm. I don't hear To Kill a Mockingbird or Shakespeare. What I hear is a tradition of gatekeeping. So those classic texts bring with them connotations. Right? Books are not a monolith, and it's not about the books. The most frequent targets that we're seeing now of book bans are marginalized communities, just persons of color and LGBTQ+ groups. PEN America said last year, hyperbolic and misleading rhetoric about things like porn in schools and sexually explicit, harmful, and age-inappropriate materials led to the removal of thousands of books covering a range of topics and themes for young audiences. Overwhelmingly, book bans target books on race or racism, or featuring characters of color, as well as books with LGBTQ+ characters. So notably, most instances of book bans affect young adult books, middle grade books, chapter books, or picture books, right? Books specifically written and selected for younger audiences. Now, classics are social capital. And again, going back and thinking about how you might define that term and what texts might fall into that category should think about what those texts have in common. The stories we center in our classrooms and libraries are the stories we're saying are important. You can't see it if you can't be it. And so when we are banning, when we're removing, when we're censoring, when we're calling books by and about LGBTQ plus authors, for example, age inappropriate, what we're saying to students is that their lives don't matter, because some of the students who walk into classrooms and libraries today belong to those communities. The classics, To Kill a Mockingbird, 1984, etc., they don't need your advocacy, right? They're classic books and they're protected by that label. It's almost like Kevlar of sorts. To Kill a Mockingbird was published back in 1960. It's been challenged ad nauseum ever since. It is still there. Harper Lee does not need your help. So what does? Books by and about LGBTQ plus authors, books by authors of color, books featuring positive representations of historically or traditionally marginalized communities. In the past couple of decades, we've seen the rise of YA as a subgenre. So that's young adult literature, and it's easily accessible. So it often is easily banned. And if you ban it, they won't necessarily come. If you take it out of a school, they won't necessarily go to a bookstore or a public library. Every time we would read To Kill a Mockingbird with my students in class, categorically, every single year, I would have students say, we know racism is bad, but it was worse then than it was now. Contemporary, relevant, reflective stories matter, not only for the folks they represent, but for the folks they don't. If you think about high school reading lists, To Kill a Mockingbird was the most recent text I had on my list. Again, I said it was published in 1960. Contrast that high school reading list with what young people are actually reading. We asked them, and they're telling us, not only with the e-card, but with book lists. And those books are often YA, often LGBTQ+, often by and about authors of color. They're not the classics. And those are the books, because those are the lives that need your protection. They need your outrage. I think, Nick, we're ready for that next slide.
Okay, great. Thank you, Summer. I'm struck by what you were talking about here. We have this slide up here as sort of representations of some of the books that we might want to be better in our advocacy, like standing up for voices that certainly represent people who are feeling marginalized and targeted, were reflected in some of these stories. I'm reminded of an article, and folks, if you'd like to go back and check it out, it was late in 2020, I believe. Richard Gene So, a professor of English up in McGill University, had published something in the New York Times, a report. He had gone back and looked at all the fiction titles that were published by major publishers in the United States from 1950 to 2018. And he was looking to identify basically sort of diversity issues in the publishing industry, of which we all sort of know that there are. There are also diversity issues in librarianship as well. And we focus on it quite a bit, and it's been stubborn. It's just been stubbornly sort of static for a very long time. We're getting better, publishing industry getting better. But Richard Gene So, Professor So, had done this research about all fiction titles published from 1950 to 2018, and was even surprised about his findings. He found that 95% of all fiction books from 1950 to 2018 were written by white authors. And so I interpret that as, a lot of the books now that are being targeted are written by people of color. They're about, they have feature characters, LGBTQ plus characters, are written by LGBTQ plus individuals. Like these books are rare. These stories are very rare and should be the focus of our, as you say, some of our outreach and our sort of urgency to protect. These are stories that it's almost a miracle that they've actually gotten through in some ways, and they're the ones that need our protection. So I think we should, there are books that are out there that I'm not comfortable reading, but I want to understand, and I want to make sure that I can stand up and with equal fervor push back against censorship of some of these titles as others, as you mentioned, Summer.
Right. So what you see on the screen there is actually are actually some takeaways and some excerpts from a report that several members, including Nick, of the Books Unbanned team recently released. And this report shares key findings and themes drawn from a sample of 855 testimonials from Books Unbanned cardholders. Those are young people between the ages of 13 and 21. So out of thousands and thousands of statements collected by BPL and one of our partner libraries in Books Unbanned, Seattle Public, from April 2022 to December 2023. So out of those 647 testimonials that were provided to either library during the sign-up process with applicants sharing why they were signing up for the card. The remaining 208 of those testimonials were provided to BPL by cardholders during the process renewing their Books Unbanned card after 1 year. And so we asked them to answer the question of how they had benefited from the program. And I want to share with you again, because nothing for teens without teens, young people's voices are at the center really, or should be at the center of this conversation. A quote from one of our young adult cardholders. And so this young person said, "They are banning some of my favorite books, and it makes me feel very unwelcome in my school. Thank you for helping me." We recognize that Books Unbanned is not a cure-all. It's not an antidote. It's a salve. And so we're here today really to call you to activism and advocacy as well, because as I've mentioned before, as Dick has mentioned before as well, it ain't about the books. It's about the lives behind, between, and before their pages.
Thank you, Summer. And I believe we've just been joined by Christopher. We were just talking about advocating on behalf of young people, but also working in concert with them as partners to push back against book bans. I'm so glad that you're here, Christopher. What we'll do right now, because I know that you have a very tight schedule and you're very busy. You've got a lot going on. So I just wanted to welcome you. And what I'll do is sort of queue up the video that you'd like to show. And in the meantime, if you want to hop on and say a few words, we'll get started. Going through all of this. And here you are. So Christopher, would you like me to play the video, or would you like to jump on and introduce it?
Yeah, you could just go play the video.
Okay. Yeah, thank you again so much for coming.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christopher Lau, and I'm here to share with you the profound impact of my unique advocacy, Unbanned Coolies. The inspiration behind this advocacy comes from a children's book called Coolies. This book is where I saw characters that looked like me, my parents, and my grandparents. I found a connection to the culture and the struggles of Chinese immigrants. It was disheartening to learn that Coolies was on the list of banned books, which hit me hard, igniting a desire to take action. To address the pressing issue of book banning, I founded Unbanned Coolies, a platform that's making waves globally. Banning books is almost like erasing history. How will people know about the hard work Chinese immigrants went through in building the Transcontinental Railroad if Coolies is no longer on shelves? This doesn't just apply to Coolies, it applies to many other books out there. You see, books have an incredible power. They transport us to different worlds, bridge understandings, and nurture empathy. But today, some want to ban books, particularly those that tackle topics like LGBTQ+ experiences, racism, diverse cultures. Banning these books isn't fair, especially when they help people understand themselves and their world. We need stories that reflect our diverse society. Imagine Being told that a book about someone like you is unfit for schools, it's very troubling. Take Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda and Jared Martin. They help readers understand LGBTQ plus experiences and racial injustices. What sets Unbanned Coolies apart is that it's not just an advocacy, it's a platform for awareness. These conversations aim to educate and inspire. It's a space where literacy leaders, educators, and best-selling authors join me to discuss the importance of free expression and the consequence of censorship. Unbanned Coolies stands for the freedom to read, learn, and grow diverse literature. Our democracy thrives when we embrace all voices and perspectives. After all, this is 2023. I urge you to support my mission. For books that save lives, representation is at stake, and representation in literature matters. Unbanned Coolies, with its unique YouTube channel and podcast featuring renowned guests, is making a global difference. And together, let's make a worldwide impact. Join me in this crucial journey to ensure that everyone's story matters and book banning becomes a thing of the past, not just in our nation, but across the world. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm
Let's-
Christopher.
Thank you, Christopher.
Yeah, thank you everyone for watching that video.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christopher Lau.
Ooh. I don't know. I look so young in that video. I feel like I look young. I don't know. Anyway, thank you all for taking the time to watch this presentation. So I'll just give a brief summary about what you guys can do to help me in this advocacy. So something you guys can help us do is you guys don't need to stand in front of libraries with protest signs. You guys don't need to chant anything. I already tried that. But what you can do is pretty simple. Just add your name and email to a petition that I created. So by adding your name, you're supporting a nonprofit organization called Every Library. They're tirelessly working in communities across the country to safeguard books on shelves, protect librarians from lawsuits, and maintain libraries as spaces free from political interference. Please turn your camera smartphone and direct it to this QR code that Nick showed right here. And there should be a website in yellow that pops up on your device. Just scroll down and add your first and last name, email, and your zip code. You don't have to enter your phone number unless you want to. And please share this petition with your friends and family.
Great. Thank you, Christopher. Do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions that we have you here for the audience? So we were just Summer and I were just going through more of the formal presentation about the work and some of the things that were sort of undergirding this issue of censorship. But you are a young person who was motivated to take action because you were directly impacted by book bans. Do you find that young people or some of your peers are just waiting for more support from other people to build a better network of advocacy around this issue? How do you see the landscape right now of advocacy?
So right now, I feel like a lot of people aren't joining in because there isn't a lot of awareness about book bans, and a lot of people don't really feel affected by it. And basically, one way I feel like that we can all help is just by starting to do advocacy work and letting other people know. And the reason I think this is so helpful is because when books are banned, you feel that impact, but with other people, they know that you're in this fight together with them. So I think that would have been very nice when I started my advocacy, because I had to start alone when I started it. But I think that's one of the main reasons a lot of my peers that I know and a lot of other people don't start their advocacy. Was that your question?
Yeah. No, that's good. What we're trying to do now is we're heading into an election season where I just anticipate a lot of these issues are going to come to the fore even more. Starting in 2021, 2022, when we started Books Unbanned, we noticed that there was a record number of book bans and challenges that were reported to the American Library Association. It was, I think, something like 2,200 that were reported to the organization. And then, the following year it became another record-breaking number. And then just this last year, just in 2024, it's another, it's like 4,200 books that were challenged or banned across the United States and growing. So even despite some of the really great efforts of people on this call, like, we're still sort of facing a very coordinated and networked, very well networked assault on some of these democratic institutions like libraries and schools. So I've always wondered about sort of our effectiveness in coordinating our efforts well, and perhaps, some of the reason that we haven't been so successful, or we're just starting to become successful, is because we never thought that it would happen to libraries, in schools. Like, year over year, libraries in particular have been, people see them as some of the most trustworthy institutions in our communities. So we rank up by firefighters in terms of, public trust. So I'm not sure if we were necessarily ready for the assault that we were to receive. And thank you for leading us into some of the actions that we can all take. I mean, certainly every library is a library advocacy group that is around to help people in their local communities. Advocate for libraries, advocate for better budgets, make sure that they're helping people, push back against censorship issues that they find in their communities. And they're a really great group to be a part of. But ultimately, everyone on this call, and folks who really appreciate and support public institutions like libraries, we have a lot of people who are in school board meetings who really need support from people like you to go in and stand up to people who are shouting down educators and principals in school board meetings. You need to speak out. You need to demonstrate to other people who might be afraid to speak out that it's okay to do so. Engage people locally, your friends and neighbors. It's, social cohesion, requires us to get together and, repeatedly and work on common problems. This is what Eric Kleinenberg, sociologist, constantly reinforces. It's insufficient just to, to adhere to abstract principles and values. We need to get out there and meet people and work, and we need to do that repeatedly. Summer, do you have anything to add?
I do. Thank you, Nick. And so again, like you see on the screen there, show up, speak out, engage locally, vote, and repeat. If we think about where the bulk of these censorship challenges are happening, they're happening in local communities, at school board levels. They're happening in state government. And things, as we're seeing, will not get easier anytime soon, and they may never. There's a disconnect between the numbers that we see, right, every year from the ALA and PEN America of books that are challenged and banned. This number seems to keep rising. And yet polls by organizations such as Every Library that Christopher mentioned are showing that the vast majority of folks actually do support their schools and libraries and are against the banning of books. So what's the disconnect? I think we might have an answer for that. As Martin Luther King famously said, right, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But here's the thing, someone has to do the bending, right? Hope isn't a guarantor of success, but rather it's really a willingness to work towards something better. So it's really up to you, our audience, to keep the words, keep the faith, and really to keep it up. So this is your call to action, as you heard Christopher say, right? A call that requires, really, it demands an answer. The young people of today, and thank you, Christopher, again, for your voice, they need your active support, right? So they don't become us, giving this exact same presentation again tomorrow and tomorrow and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Your voice carries further than you know. So I always find it useful to remember those 3 P's of advocacy, right? Speak positively, proactively, and publicly. So help us shape our public schools and libraries, because as you've seen, they shape our communities and our students. The pages are power. We need to protect them. And so here's how. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you at the library. Christopher, real quick, can I jump in and ask you, what are some of your favorite titles that you've read recently? Any come to mind?
Yeah, The Bluest Eye, The Scarlet Letter, those are 2 ones I read pretty recently, and I think those ones are pretty cool actually.
Awesome, thank you.
Great. And I think that we can, I would love to hear from folks who are on this call and start a conversation around what your thoughts are around the landscape of censorship that you're seeing, and different ways or ideas that you have, in terms of pushing back or building a network of support.
Great, Nick. I have a few comments in the questions and answers site here. First of all, John Brecka, whom you all know, who happens to be my cousin and brought you all to us in terms of an idea for an Encore Learning presentation, comments, Summer, I found your comments about what makes a classic a real eye-opener. I also thought that too, because you really go to the classics that you've been raised with, and your interpretation was quite different. So that's a comment, not a question. Susan Post says, in this area, it seems to be school boards rather than libraries that are having the problem with outrageous demands. Any comments from any of you? School boards versus libraries?
Yeah, I would say that there was a lot. Well, Summer could probably talk about the school board side of it. I would say that PEN America has been studying quite a lot the school library bans, and they've been on top of that, and educational gag orders and anti-CRT legislation and things like that. And the American Library Association really collects information and data on library challenges and bans. And I would say that it was sort of a slower ramp up for this kind of censorship to start to appear as much as it was in school libraries, in public libraries. But public libraries can be fairly vulnerable in this area, particularly if they don't have a way that someone from the public can challenge a title on the shelf of a library, which is a right of any person who lives in a community. It's sort of tied into our First Amendment rights to petition government. So if somebody wants to come into a library and say, I disagree with this library spending government funds to put this particular book on the shelf, it's their right to go through a process to have that book challenged, basically. But some libraries leave themselves vulnerable because they don't have a coordinated sort of a process, or a very well articulated process for a member of the public to do that. And that just leaves it in the sort of like the realm of public pressure to remove books from the shelves of libraries. And we're hearing a lot more stories about school board, or rather public library board meetings getting turned upside down by people coming in and making demands. Summer?
Yeah, I think going back to the recent ALA, I believe it was ALA report on book challenges, book bans, book censorship in general, in the past year, so 2023, I think it was the number of titles targeted for censorship in public libraries increased by, I want to say the statistic is 92%, I believe, over the previous year. So as Nick indicated, this may have started with school libraries and classroom library shelves, but it's certainly migrated to the public library as well. In terms of school boards, I think if you're looking to destroy the mechanism of public school, right, which is one of the few institutions that we really have left in this country that can promise upward mobility of any kind. If you're looking to destroy those mechanisms, school board is a great place to start, because they're often low turnout elections. People aren't paying attention, people aren't watching, and that's what has happened. Folks weren't paying attention. And so we have small AstroTurf groups funded by lots of big organizations like the Heritage Foundation, for example, the DeVos family, the Walton family. They go into school boards, they make a show. And the point is to use the process and the system to overwhelm it, right? And to take these books off the shelves because they are scary books to this small group of people. So school boards are a place where people aren't paying attention. Therefore, they are the perfect place to start.
Thank you. We got a comment, actually a question here. Christopher, and your QR code, it asks for a post code. That's a zip code, right?
Looks like Christopher may have jumped off, but yeah, the postcode would be the zip code.
Zip code. Okay, just want to clarify. Another comment from John. Oh, Chris, if he's gone, it says Chris. Well, I'll read it, and then if Chris can come back on. Ideas come to us at any time, like a muse visiting us out of the blue. Can you tell us more about the idea, how the idea came to you about Cooley website? But we'll see if he chimes back in. Kate Matos said, I am retired. When I listed all the people who meaningfully helped me in my career, 60% of them were gay men. That's right, 60%. When we discriminate and foster hate, we are stopping opportunities for many, one of whom might be, can somebody scroll up this, Laura? One of whom
one of them just might be you.
One of them might be you. Comments?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we need to when we discriminate and foster hate, we are stopping opportunities for many, one of whom just might be you. I think that gets to the heart of it, and also understanding too that people who are, constantly on the business end of some of these attacks have been so for so long that the ultimate goal, I think, for, again, we keep on going back to this, it's not just about books, it's really about determining, who has the right to exist in our communities and who doesn't. And by removing books that represent and speak to particular groups of people, you're demonstrating to them that they have no place in your community. And, the next step is for them to feel ostracized, marginalized and excluded from civic life. And certainly that's not what we aspire to, at least my interpretation of this democracy that we're in. It's not something that, it goes against that. It's something quite different. And, you now start having, writers like, Timothy Snyder and John Freeman or Rebecca Solnit, folks who, writers who sort of reemerge every time we're in a position where we're tilting toward or tilting away from democracy and maybe towards something more authoritarian almost. People are starting to pay attention to them a little bit more as sort of warnings for things to come. And so this is baked right into it when you start to remove voices, exclude community members, and treat people like they're others and they don't belong.
I had a question. Much of what you talked about had to do with marginalized communities and young people. Are there also more general interest books that I might read that are being targeted for banning as well? I'm thinking Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings I've read has been one of those books, but are there others that we might be more familiar with?
Yeah, I think so. And Summer I always channel Summer on this, and she'll talk about books that are caught up in the larger dragnet to ban books. Like you'll find some books there that you might be scratching your head. There's Kurt Vonnegut still gets caught up in the net, and Harper Lee does, and some of the books that are deemed classics that Summer was talking about, certainly. because I don't really think that people necessarily care individually about what, what particularly like those kinds of titles. If there are sort of like casualties like that, I mean, no book should be banned, of course, but I think the emphasis that a lot of the people who are banning books, the emphasis is generally on the young adult titles that are talking about different identities and experiences that don't mirror their own. But certainly, every now and again, you'll see Slaughterhouse-Five show up on it. You'll see, some Nobel Prize winning, author like Toni Morrison in there, and Harper Lee and things like that. But I don't know, Summer, do you have any thoughts on that?
Can you repeat the question for me?
My question is the books that are being targeted. I know, certainly what you've all talked about are youth-oriented books and books written by or targeted to young people or marginalized communities. But is there a broader group of books that are being targeted that are separate from the authors or the target audiences that you've mentioned?
When we think about books being challenged and banned, it used to sort of be a novelty in previous years to say, oh, look at the dictionary. The dictionary has been banned before because it has definitions of naughty words before. Oh my goodness, look at the Grapes of Wrath is being banned in Russia because even the poorest of the poor in America have a car, right? And the USSR or the Soviet Union, may not have wanted their people to see that. I always go back though to the idea that it's not helpful and it's not too terribly meaningful to focus on the titles themselves. If you look hard enough, you can find just about any book anywhere. Someone has had a problem with it. That's why books are great. It's much more important, I think, to think beyond the titles themselves and to the ideas and really the individuals that they represent. This isn't just a I could be next kind of thing. This is a lives right now are being erased. Young people especially are being told that their stories don't count. And there's a term called social capital, and we see that in a lot of books labeled classics, right? Books that are sort of touchstones of society that you have to know about in order to enter certain spaces. And those books that we center like that, they communicate something, right? These are the stories that are important to us. These are the people that matter. And not all of our students, are reflected in those stories. And so, again, I would go back to, it's sort of a roundabout way to answer the question of, it's really not the titles.
Okay.
It's the people.
So that maybe I'll make this the last question here. Are there places that have seen the light and stopped banning books in their community that were originally at the forefront or active in banning books and are no longer doing that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think that so there are groups out there who are sort of organized, and they're doing some of the shouting in school board meetings and at library board meetings, things like that. There's one group, Moms for Liberty, that's been around since the lockdowns during COVID, and sort of refocus their energy around schools and education and libraries shortly after when COVID was waning. And they were fairly successful in winning some elections, particularly early on in 2021-ish, in different school boards, and they started to have some political sort of capital. But this last election in school boards across the United States last November, we're starting to see signs of some pushback on that, depending if you're reading the Washington Post or the New York Times or whatever paper, depends on sort of like where these statistics come from. But it's reported that up to about 80% of the Moms for Liberty backed candidates for school board positions in the elections in November lost. And, moderate and just regular candidates assume positions in school boards. So there are signs that some of this is being kind of pushed to the other direction, including some efforts, some lawsuits actually challenging some state legislation, particularly in Florida, Escambia County in Florida. There's a group of plaintiffs that includes Penguin Random House and some authors that are being challenged in like schools there in Florida, as well as in Arkansas. The Central Arkansas Public Library System is leading a lawsuit against the state of Arkansas against some of the educational gag orders and librarian criminalization bills that they've been passing. And they actually had a judge side with them on certain provisions in their case recently. So we're starting to get organized. Again, people who are sort of defending and pushing back, defending intellectual freedom and pushing back against censorship. There's signs that things are shifting, but there's a lot more work to be done. And Summer, I know that you have some thoughts on this too. We can't rest on our laurels, but we definitely need to continue to fight.
Yeah, I would just follow that up with, it's a complex issue in part because censorship oftentimes is highly localized. So it exists and manifests in different ways in different communities. And the real threat is soft or silent censorship. And so this is where, due to something like an educational gag order or a divisive concepts law, might exist and cause folks, knee-jerk reaction to self-censor. Those types of things, are not being reported. But as Nick mentioned, there is beginning to be some pushback, not only in things like school board races. We just recently had a round of primaries, but also in kind of a larger sense. But I would say to that as well, and I would sort of follow that up with, again, a call to action. That part of the reason we're here in this space dealing with this now is because a vast majority of folks took their eye off the ball. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It's, it requires full participation at all times. And so I think, we can launch lawsuits, and we should absolutely go after laws. Like in Oklahoma, the law is called HB 1775. So it prohibits discussions around race, gender, and sex in educational spaces. That law should absolutely be repealed. It's a violation of the First and 14th Amendments. But again, as we've seen, laws come and go, right? They can be enacted, they can be repealed. But what really matters is sustained civic engagement. That's going to be the thing that turns the tide. And until that happens, I don't think we can breathe easy.
Well, on that note, on that call to action, I'm going to conclude our presentation today. This was very interesting, and thank you all for the work that you're doing and for also sharing it with all of us all the way down here in Virginia. It's very, very interesting. I mean, I think we could ask, I have a bunch more questions here, but I'm going to close it here. So thank you, Nick. Thank you, Summer. Thank you, Chris, if you're still on. I don't know if you're still on. Very interesting presentation. So thank you. To all of our participants here, please do take a survey after this, and also think about joining us for the copyright tour, Library of Congress. May 7th, you need to register for it. You need to be a member, by the way, of Encore Learning to register. So with that, we'll close it out. Thank you very much. Enjoy being in the uber cool Brooklyn. You know the way it is. It's just uber cool up in Brooklyn. So
we welcome you anytime, Louise. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone
Thank you, Summer. You were terrific, and Christopher. Okay,
Thank
we'll
you,
see everybody.
you.
Bye-bye now.